Hello, everyone. So thank you guys so much for joining, first of all. As I was so wonderfully just introduced, my name is Kathryn Grayson Nanz. I'm the developer advocate for Kendo React at Progress, but that was not really what I always planned to be doing. In fact, I actually have a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree in studio arts. I went to college to become a graphic designer, and I did. I worked in ad agencies for years afterwards. I did all sorts of graphic design work. But slowly, graphic design kind of turned into email design and web design, which turned into email and web development, which turned into UI design and front end development. I just kind of wandered my way over project by project and job by job until here I am today. I could probably fill a whole nother session just talking about the experience of moving between those roles and why and how, but I really only bring it up today to give you guys a little bit of context on why I'm here talking about design. So these days, I really like to live in the world between design and development. I've really intentionally sought out jobs and opportunities that have supported me continuing to kind of work with a foot in each world. I can't imagine never designing again any more than I can imagine never developing again. I love them both so much, and they feel like two sides of the same coin to me. However, as someone who has had that experience in my career, I've also really gotten to see firsthand the way that so many developers can struggle with design. And that could be in the form of like difficulty collaborating with the design team, frustration when trying to work on like an app or a side project of your own, or even just those kind of small design decisions, stuff like choosing the right color for a button or determining the right amount of padding or fitting a new feature into an existing layout. All that stuff tends to kind of slip through the cracks and become a developer's problem, even if you do technically work with a design team. And when you don't know a lot about design, every one of those choices can feel really overwhelming. I can't count the number of times I've heard a developer say, it just doesn't look right, or like, I can't make it look professional. They can figure out that something is wrong, but they cannot identify why. And it's like trying to solve a riddle in another language. The problem itself is one thing, and that's hard enough. But on top of that, you don't even have the words to describe it. And that's really what I'm hoping to offer you today, is kind of a Rosetta Stone for understanding the world of design by learning some of the fundamentals. Enough knowledge for you to identify what is happening in your designs and why. But first, there is a myth about design that I think we need to debunk before we go any further. That is the idea of having the eye, quote unquote. There's this assumption that design, or really any kind of artistic talent, is something that you're just born with. And if you don't have that natural gift, then you're just out of luck. This is frankly completely untrue. Design is a science, and it's based on what we know about how the human eye and the brain processes the world. Once you have a grasp of those fundamentals, you can create designs that will very naturally align with how humans interpret information, or as we call them, good designs. So even if you're not looking to understand every single thing about art and design, you can still build up a skill set that enables you to understand what makes a design good and how to replicate that in your own work. So that being said, probably time for us to start doing some of this learning, right? So let's get into it. Welcome to Foundations of Design. Today, we're going to talk through the basics of color, layout, and typography. I will be your professor, and I promise it will be much less painful than all the art history lectures that I had to sit through in college. First things first, color. Color is really complex because the way that we perceive and interpret a color is based entirely on the other colors that are around it. For example, at first glance, these two small squares kind of look like they're different colors, but in truth, they are exactly the same. Depending on which background color it's paired with, our eyes will perceive the color of that smaller square differently. Having this contextual awareness is really huge when it comes to our interfaces. A color that looks one way in isolation might look completely different when it's put into a layout with other colors. In fact, that's where people tend to struggle the most. It's creating color schemes. But in order to talk about color schemes, we first need to take a step back and talk about the color wheel. chances are you have seen a color wheel before at some point, even if it was just this one the last time one of your apps crashed. This, however, is the much more pleasant Johannes Eden color wheel, which does an excellent job of demonstrating the relationship between different colors. When you combine primary colors, the red, yellow, and blue there at the center, the result will be a secondary color, orange, green, or purple. Mixing a secondary color back with a primary color results in a tertiary color, which you can see along the outer ring. In that way, you can derive every color in existence from those three primary colors. Now, when we are talking about a color's actual color, we're talking about its hue. That's the thing that makes us describe a color as green as opposed to red or yellow or blue. But hue is really only one half of a color. There's also value. Value is the lightness or darkness of the hue. It's what creates the difference between like sky blue and navy. You can change the value of a color in three ways: by adding white to create a tint, adding gray to create a tone, or adding black to create a shade. The color wheel can also kind of be split into two halves, warm and cool colors. Warm colors are your reds, oranges, yellows, things that evoke feelings of warmth and sunlight. Cool colors, on the other hand, are your blues, greens, and purples that we tend to associate with feelings of coolness or night or shadow. We extend these warm and cool feelings into their connected emotions. So warm colors tend to evoke feelings of happiness. They're energizing, they're vibrant, they're exciting. Cool colors, on the other hand, will feel more somber. They're associated with relaxation, steadiness, and knowledge. When we understand the color wheel, we have a tool that will let us visualize the relationship that colors have with each other. And we can use that to know in advance which colors will work well together and which won't. When choosing colors, I recommend using one of these 4 color schemes as a basis. And we're going to talk through each one, so don't worry too much about like taking notes now. First is the simplest, monochromatic. It uses the tints, tones, and shades of only a single hue. It's really easy because you only need that one color. But the downside is that you might feel kind of a lack of variety while you're working. It can be difficult to create sharp contrasts. This painting, Mark Tanzi's Forward Retreat, is a really good example of using a monochromatic color scheme to create a feeling of intensity. That's because repeated elements create emphasis, like when you underline something multiple times, or verbally when we repeat words, say like, no, I really, really mean it this time. Repetition is a tool that we can use in multiple ways to tell the user, pay attention to this. And of course, if we are talking about monochromatic user interfaces, then we got to talk about Facebook. Facebook is blue, blue, blue all the way down, and we only very occasionally see other colors in the case of things like errors or informational warnings. A kind of similar color scheme is analogous, which uses colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. This is kind of my go-to recommendation for complete design newbies. Like a monochromatic color scheme, it's intuitive and really hard to mess up. But it also has the advantage of giving you a few more colors to play with, so you kind of get the best of both worlds. In the wild, a good example of an analogous color scheme is BP. They have that green, and yellow that stretches right across that section of the color wheel in a perfect arc. Now we start to branch across the wheel a little bit. Complementary color schemes use colors that are exactly opposite each other. Orange and blue is one that's pretty common, especially as you can see in movie posters. And for a UI example, let's take a look at Amazon. They have this orange logo, but orange is actually a really hard color to use in interfaces. It's difficult to make accessible, and it often feels too bright or too loud. So here they've opted for a complementary scheme, which allows them to include their brand orange without making it the main event. Design-wise, it's a really smart and practical trick. If you ever find yourself struggling to design around a difficult color, you can try looking across the wheel. Last on our list is triadic. This color scheme has 3 main colors, equally spaced from each other, that create a triangle across the color wheel. Vermeer's Girl with the Pearl Earring painting uses this color scheme with her red lips, her blue wrap, and her yellow clothes. In a less fine art example, we can take a look at the Pepsi website. Yellow is not one of their official brand colors, but you can tell that they know their color theory because yellow is very naturally incorporated in the photos and the accent colors to bring the whole design together. All right, now that we've kind of talked through colors, let's talk a little bit about the actual elements on the page, which means we need to talk about brains. There's a lot that we still don't know about the human brain, but one of the things that we do know is that our brains love to categorize things. It's how we try to make sense of the absolute deluge of sensory input that we get every single day. When we look at a design, we attempt to organize the elements on the page so that we can digest the content. When we've designed a layout that doesn't look good or right, it's often because we're unintentionally working against those kinds of organizational methods. Working with them will make our designs more intuitive. Like color, there are principles of layout that you can use in order to align your work with how the brain organizes stuff. One of the most popular of these is Gestalt theory, which identifies 6 main patterns that we use to group and make sense of information. These will make a lot more sense with some examples. So let's go ahead and take a look. Similarity means that we assume association between similar elements. For example, here our brains will organize these shapes into horizontal lines. Because the shapes and colors here are the same horizontally, we assume there has to be some kind of a relationship. Closure means that we'll try to fill in the missing gaps or spaces. So here we see a square and a diamond, despite the fact that there's no square or diamond actually present, just these little Pac-Man looking wedges. Our brains have inferred the square and the diamond by mentally closing the gap. Continuity means that the viewer's eye will continue along the same unbroken path unless it is actively interrupted. It's kind of similar to closure in that it has to do with how the eye moves and how it follows that invisible line. But while closure has to do with the line itself, continuity has to do with when that line is interrupted or not. Proximity means that we naturally group items that are placed closely together. In this example, we'll group the 2 left-hand elements into a single vertical column because they're closer to each other than they are to the right-hand element. Figure ground refers to our attempt to impose our 3D understanding of the world onto 2D objects and designs. Because we're so used to functioning in 3 dimensions with a sense of depth, we naturally identify things that are closer to us as more immediately relevant, and therefore the subject or the figure, while everything else kind of gets relegated to the background. Symmetry captures our natural sense of balance. We really want things to feel equal, and when they don't, it can be kind of unsettling or off-putting. Symmetry does not have to be perfectly exact the way that this example is, but it does mean that our viewers will seek out and feel reassured by visual balance in our designs. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. Now that we have an understanding of why and how our brains attempt to organize things, we can combine that knowledge with visual hierarchy to create interfaces that capture and direct our users' attention. Visual hierarchy is the practice of creating contrast in your design by combining the use of size, placement, and color to manipulate the visual weight of each element and make your most important elements stand out. Size is the fastest and easiest way to create a visual hierarchy. When you make one element much larger than everything else on the page, the viewer's eye will begin there, almost regardless of anything else. Let's take a look at this in action. Now, I feel obligated to kind of begin by saying that the word cloud is actually a pretty lazy design, so maybe don't reach for this one in your own work. But it is a really excellent example of creating hierarchy through size, because here our eyes are immediately drawn to the word education. A good rule of thumb is to make your most important element the largest thing, and then set the size of your other elements relative to that based on relevance. Another great way to create hierarchy is to put the most important items at the top and then work your way down in order of prioritization, like a newspaper. As you can see in this example, the most crucial information is at the top: the logo, the title, the breaking news headline. Then the text gets smaller as you move down the page, combining size and placement to indicate the relative importance of each piece. The last piece of the visual hierarchy puzzle is color. Color is a little different since, as we said before, the way that it's interpreted is dependent entirely on the colors that are around it. And as you can see here, it's that contrast in value between the background color and the color of your element that determines its visual weight, and by extent, its place in the hierarchy. So basically, the greater a contrast you create between the background and the element, the more that element will come forward into like the front space, and everything else will kind of recede to the background. Missed that slide, should have changed it earlier. Now that you have an understanding of how to manipulate the visual weight of your elements, the next step is understanding how to evenly distribute that weight across your composition using balance. Because humans had to master balance in order to do things like stand upright, avoid danger, build stable structures, we really strongly associate balance with safety and with comfort. Looking at unbalanced things can make us feel uneasy or tense, and we really don't want our users to feel that way when they're looking at our user interfaces. Visual balance works pretty much the same way that physical balance does. The elements need to be equally balanced on either side of a center axis. So try imagining the two halves of your design like a seesaw or a set of scales. For example, which side of this would you say is visually heavier? The left or the right? If you guessed the larger square, you would be correct. Even though the squares are the same shape and the same color, the larger size gives it a heavier visual weight, and that makes this image feel off-center, even though technically it's not. The easiest way to create balance is through symmetry, which is perfectly mirroring two sides of a design. This gives designs a feeling of strength, permanence, and stability. But balance does not always have to be perfectly symmetrical. It just means that the elements' visual weights are roughly equivalent. Asymmetrical balance is what you'll see most often in web and UI design, because while perfectly symmetrical design is beautiful, it's also pretty impractical. After all, we don't usually get UI elements already matched in perfect sets, right? A really common asymmetrical design pattern is this kind of text-image balance. But you can also create asymmetrical balance through placement. Larger items near the middle of a composition can be balanced by smaller ones closer to the edge. In UI design, we see this pattern used a lot with sidebars. Thus far, we've focused a lot on the elements that we're adding to the page. But the other equally important part is where you don't put anything at all, the white space. White space gives our eyes a place to rest and our minds a chance to process what they've seen. It's how we can group or separate elements to create associations or prevent them. It's really, really easy to get carried away while you're designing. In fact, I would say that is one of the most common mistakes, especially for people who are just starting out. There's kind of this feeling that we started with a blank page and it's our job to fill it, so we just keep putting things on it. But it's very important to remember that every single element on your page should serve a purpose. In fact, this is kind of the difference between art and design. In art, the way that it looks is infinitely more important than the purpose. Art can, of course, have a purpose, communicate a message, make people feel an emotion, but that's always kind of secondary to the way that the artist has chosen to present the material. Whereas with design, that's almost exactly the other way around. The purpose should always come first, even if that means we're making a decision that might not be as beautiful or as interesting. It's always most important that the user can accomplish whatever task they came to our app or website to do. So if you don't have enough white space, it's very likely that that's happening because there are things in your design that aren't actually doing anything, aren't actually helping your users achieve that purpose. They're just kind of creating visual clutter. The more of that you can remove, the better your designs will be. Finally, our last topic, typography. Type is really powerful. We learn to read at a pretty young age, and from then on, we are immersed in the world of typography. Because of this, most of us can recognize bad type. After all, the goal of type is to be read, and if we can't read it, then it's not a good design. The question, as always, is the opposite. How can we create type that looks good? Typography is a world all its own, so we should really start with just a quick history lesson. Typography, the way that we think about it today, the printing of letters by machine, not by hand, begins with the printing press and metal movable type. Early movable type systems that used clay and wood were found in China as early as 1088. But movable type wouldn't really catch on until 1440, when Johannes Gutenberg invented his printing press in Germany, using a similar system of metal character blocks in the much more limited Germanic language characters. The movable type printing press is important to be aware of because it was the origin of the art of typesetting, and the foundations of that are still very much in use today. In fact, most typography terms are based on this, so it's really helpful to have that background in mind as we talk through some basics. A character is any single element, a letter, a punctuation mark, a number. If you think back to that movable type system, then a character would be any single metal block of type. A typeface is a collection of characters in a specific style. You already know these because you work with some of the most common ones every day. Things like Times New Roman, Helvetica, Calibri, so many more. A font, on the other hand, is a very specific version of a typeface. Font and typeface are words that are often used interchangeably, but they're not actually the same thing. For example, Helvetica is a typeface, but Helvetica Condensed and Helvetica Bold would be fonts. Kerning is the space between two characters. Sometimes you'll want to give two letters a little more or maybe less breathing room. Neglecting your kerning can create gaps in words where you might not have wanted them. Tracking is similar to kerning. There are another couple of words that get regularly confused. But while kerning refers specifically to the spacing between two characters, tracking is a consistent amount of spacing between all of the characters. CSS developers will know this better as letter spacing. Leading is the vertical space between your lines of text. Originally, this term comes from the literal lead strips that separated lines of characters when you were separating and setting type by hand. You might know it more as line height. It's a little thing that can make a really big difference, and it's a good way to sneak in a little extra white space. This very random group of words are all ways to describe various issues that can arise with how your type is laid out. Widows happen when the last line of text gets separated from the rest of its related paragraph by a page break or a column wrap. An orphan is the reverse, when your first line gets separated. And then runts are the scraggly little last words that will wrap onto the next line all by themselves. You can fix these by adjusting your tracking, your font size, or by adding non-breaking character spaces between words that you don't want to wrap individually. Removing all of these will make your text a lot easier to read. Rivers happen when the way that your text lines up creates white space between characters all the way down. You can kind of see a strong example of this here. This can be really distracting to your reader. And again, it's something you can fix with your tracking, with your word spacing, and the more you can avoid it, the easier your text will be to read. You might have thought a dash is a dash is a dash, right? But in fact, there are 3 different types of dashes. The hyphen is used to, obviously, hyphenate multi-part words, things like mother-in-law or friend end. Then there's the en dash, which is used to show ranges in numbers and dates, like June 10th to 20th. And finally, the em dash, which is used to separate thoughts in a sentence, like so. The names n and em dash actually come from the widths of the letter n and m characters in the font. So an en dash will always be the same width as a lowercase letter n, and an em dash will always be the same width as a lowercase letter m. Now that you know some basic terms and some things to look out for, let's talk about choosing a typeface. There are many categories and subcategories of typefaces based on their style, their usage, and their historical context. But here are some of the most common and what they're best used for. Serifs are the small decorative lines that are found on characters, usually along the top and bottom, or the end of any given line. They confer a more professional, kind of old school feeling to your type, and they're associated with tradition and legacy, and they're really good for conveying authority, expertise, and trustworthiness. If you're going to be setting large blocks of type, things like a blog article, then a serif font is really ideal. The serifs create more noticeable differences between the characters, which makes them easier to read. Working in tech, you have definitely seen a sans serif font before. Thanks to their clean and modern look, they've become really ubiquitous in our industry. It's a great choice for communicating youth, friendliness, modernity, or technology. Display typefaces are a little bit funky and a little bit weird. They're distinctive, but sometimes to the detriment of their readability. They should be used with caution. They can add a really huge burst of personality and fun to your design, but they will also call a huge amount of attention to themselves and require a pretty big font size. Script typefaces mimic handwriting. They add a lot of humanity to your design. They're often used to communicate that something is homemade, artisan, or otherwise very thoughtfully done. You don't want to use a script font for your body text, but you might be able to get away with using it for subheaders or other smaller blocks of text. Okay, folks, we covered a lot today in not a lot of time. This was kind of a speed run through the fundamentals through basically my whole first year of college. But hopefully it provided you with enough insight to start to get a feel for how and why certain design decisions are made. Really, what I want you to take away is that design is not just random guessing. It's not trying things until they feel right. It's a very science-based approach to putting different elements on the page in a way that we've learned can evoke the response that we're looking for in a viewer. Design is really powerful. And when we're leveraging these tools for our applications and our websites, we can make a huge positive difference in the user experience. Knowing these foundations puts you in a strong position for both creating your own designs and collaborating with any designers you might work with. So I really hope this was helpful to you guys. Thank you so much.
All right, well, thank you, Kathryn. That was so, like, there's so much good stuff. I think it was one of those sessions that, yeah, I think, I'll go back. Lots of people are asking for recording now, understand why, because like, as I'm doing front end.
It's an info dump, yes.
Yeah, like I'm going to go back and be like, okay, what are those colors again? Like, what does the color wheel look like? It's definitely a session I want to revisit. So thank you so much for sharing this information with us. All right, so now it's Q&A time. Okay, I see the chat is going. Let me make sure that I'm getting to the top of the questions. Yeah, Kathryn, is there a slide that has your social info on there? Some people are asking how to stay in touch. If not, I can also post it.
I said no, that would have been smart. I'm happy to put it in the chat. But yeah, you can find me at Kathryn Grayson on pretty much everything. I'm on Twitter, I'm on LinkedIn, on Polywork. So, but yeah.
Okay, I have the Twitter link, so I just put the Twitter, but
perfect.
I'm sure you could.
Yeah, I think my website is linked in my Twitter bio. So if you wanted to find me anywhere else, you can go through there, kgrayson.com. So.
Awesome. So let me start from the top, the questions. All right. Yeah. So, and I also apologize if I pronounce anyone's name wrong. We got diversity of names here. So RC asks, are there any rule of thumb you might suggest for spacing/sizing? For example, font sizes for buttons or paragraphs, line heights, or even padding for these elements?
Yeah. So generally, I'm trying to come up with the right term. There's something called an 8-point grid guide. And I am Googling it right now so that I can throw a link in the chat. And that's a really good kind of rule of thumb. And just threw a link to a Medium article that talks about the 8-point grid guide in there. And that's what's used in things like Bootstrap, where everything is kind of automatically spaced, and you can kind of lean on that to make some of the design decisions for you. But in general, you just want to look at a page and make sure that it doesn't feel too tight, that things aren't really, really close to each other, that nothing is feeling kind of overwhelming, and that nothing is drawing your attention to the wrong parts of the page. So, if somebody opens a page and the first thing they look at is kind of down at the bottom, there's probably something a little bit off with your spacing, with your visual hierarchy, and that might be a chance for you to go back and kind of revise that. Hopefully that answers your question.
All right, awesome. Sagar asked, how do we deal with different types of colors when it comes to dark and light mode themes? Okay, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of that is going to come down to that idea of contrast, right? And so you want to make sure that whether you're working in a dark mode or a light mode theme, you're creating a big difference in value between whatever your background color is and whatever your text color is. I saw someone put in the chat earlier about accessibility, and value and contrast plays a huge part of that as well when it comes to design. So there are lots of tools like color contrast checkers that can help you. You can kind of put in the colors that you're using and it will tell you if you've got enough contrast going on there. But that's going to really be the key to making dark and light modes that look good and are effective.
Yeah, awesome. I personally always prefer dark modes. Like whenever there's a setting,
I'm the same way.
Yeah, it's just
I think if you have to spend all day in front of a computer looking at a screen, it's so much easier on the eyes to have a dark mode available. And like that's accessibility too. So well worth keeping in mind.
So true. And Ayrton asks, any material that you recommend to learn more about UI or UX more in depth?
Ooh, there's definitely some. There's a book that I really like that's called I'm looking at my bookshelf. I'm not just like staring into space. It's called The Non-Designer's Design Book by Robin Williams. Not that Robin Williams, but it's really good. It is definitely a little bit more general design focused, maybe a little more print design focused, but a lot of that kind of at that basic and foundational level will port over to UI design really well. And the other thing that I think is probably not a popular answer is that you just kind of have to keep doing it. The more you practice and the more you like kind of flex that design muscle, the more natural it becomes. And the more like when people talk about that idea of having the eye, that's mostly what they're talking about. It's just that idea of practice. It's the same as coding. You know, the more you do it, the more you kind of remember the different syntax for whatever you're writing, and you kind of already understand the structure and the architecture questions. You don't have to kind of do that heavy lift every time from the beginning. And design's the same way. So
yeah, it's that kind of intuition that you develop over time, right? It's like coding. All right. And Constanza asked about books. Okay, so you just shared about that book.
Yeah, so that's probably my favorite. I'm trying to think if there's others that are excellent. From a UX perspective, the design of everyday things is really good. And I also really like, sorry, I am just like staring at my bookshelf here. There's one called Technically Wrong, which I enjoyed quite a bit about kind of thinking through. I'll grab it so I can show it off. Technically Wrong, sexist apps, biased algorithms, and other threats of toxic tech, that talks through the ways that our biases can kind of show themselves through design. That I think is a really good read for anyone that's going to be building software.
Yeah, awesome. So. And I also find that the titles of these books pretty funny, like pretty right? Catchy, I guess.
It's clever.
Yeah, very clever. Yeah, that's the word. All right, awesome. So next one, Scott asks, any design tips regarding mobile first responsive layouts?
Yes. So I think just the phrase mobile first is a good place to start, right? Like I think that's kind of become something that we throw around, but we don't really stop to think anymore about what it really means, which is literally starting from the mobile layout and then building that out. It's so normal for us to want to kind of start with that idea of the browser. And despite, how long we've been designing and creating for multiple screen sizes, I think when most of us think about a website, we still kind of think about that like horizontal, whatever, 1600 by whatever kind of layout. The more we can kind of break ourselves of that habit, the easier mobile design will be. The other thing that I think is worth kind of keeping in mind and moving from is that we've spent a lot of time technically approaching mobile and responsive design from the standpoint of media queries and the idea of like specific breakpoints. And more, that's not really a thing, right? So we have the technology now that we don't need to create these designs that are completely separate, where you'll kind of hit a breakpoint and everything will snap. CSS now, modern CSS allows us to create more fluid designs where things are constantly kind of resizing and reshaping themselves to fill the available space. So I would suggest kind of looking into that idea of fluid design and kind of stepping away from that idea of having 2 or 3 completely separate designs for mobile, tablet, and desktop.
Okay, awesome. And next one is from Maria. I have a question about those sites that combine fonts, like 3 different ones to use in websites. How do you decide which one is the one for the H1, H2, etc.? Or do you have some suggestions on how to decide that? Thank you.
I'm not really familiar with those sites, so I might be missing a little bit there. But in general, I would say your H1 should be some kind of whatever display font you want to use, right? So if there's something that was a little bit more fun or a little bit more wild, that should be your H1. It's going to be eye-catching and you won't use it as much. And then your H2 should be something that'll contrast that a little bit. So if you've got something that's like super scripty for your H1, then maybe your H2 is like a little bit more standard. Maybe that's a Helvetica or something a little bit more rigid to kind of counterbalance that. And then your body text should always be as practical as possible, maybe as boring as possible is the right word. Because yeah, the emphasis should always be on how easily you can read it. You don't want to choose anything that you think looks interesting at the expense of people being able to skim through it quickly. So
yeah, for sure. George asked, like, can we have the PowerPoint? Are you open to sharing that? I don't know. Okay.
Totally. Yeah. I will grab that now. I've got it in a Google Drive.
Oh, okay, perfect. Yeah, it'll be easier to share that way.
Yeah, I'll share that in the chat. Totally.
Okay. I can also post it on the event page afterwards. So in case, yeah. Okay.
I think I've got the permissions right. So anyone tell me if you can't get at it.
Yeah. So much. Okay, let me skip down a couple more comments. V asks, what would you give suggestions for developing web app for Web3 enthusiasts? Yeah, I don't know if there's anything specific for Web3.
Yeah, so that's actually something that I see come up a lot. And the real truth is that Web3 design, and honestly, most of the Web3 front end is not different from the Web2 front end, right? Most of Web3, most of the differences in Web3 have to do with the back end and how data is stored and received. So beyond any kind of new specific components, right? So there's some new components in terms of signing into wallets and that kind of thing. But that's not really any different than the kind of sign-in components that we were creating already. All of your kind of design foundations are still going to be the same. And honestly, most of your front-end stack from a tech perspective is also still going to be the same. There's just some differences in terms of fetching data. It's just a little bit different than like an API call. But yeah, someone threw in the chat, like Web 3.0 is the new buzzword. And I think there's a little bit of that where it's like everyone wants to jump on the Web3 train, and like that's cool, but also there's not going to be a huge difference from a front end perspective.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, that's convenient. So the theories are still the same.
Yeah, totally.
All right. Okay, I might butcher this name. Sorry. Sriharsha said, very helpful session. But generally, how would you suggest that I pick fonts that will look good together? Like for the subtitle paragraph, is there any rule? Yeah, besides what you already shared, I guess.
Yeah. One of the tools that I think is nice for this is Google Fonts, right? So if you pull up their website, I'm going to see if I can like find an example and maybe share it real quick. They do a really good job of pairing a bunch of their fonts together, and they've got some good articles on like choosing type. So sometimes like if you'll pull up a specific thing there, it will kind of offer you fonts that pair well with it. And there's a whole section of fonts knowledge, which I'm also going to drop in the chat. I think they do a really good job of kind of taking that deeper dive right into type that I could not quite do in 30 minutes. So that's another good resource you can leverage.
Awesome. Yeah, lots of resources. So make sure you save those links.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just like in the chat. But
yeah, no worries. Okay, skip ahead. Well, someone commented on the lanyards behind you. I think you noticed.
Oh yeah,
the collection of those.
It's been in the game a long time. If it makes you feel better, these ones are the only like tech conferences, and these are like Comic-Cons and stuff. So it's not as impressive as it looks.
Yeah, it's still fun. Okay, I think we have time with just a few more. See if we can get to
Yeah.
the bottom. All right. So Malik asked, when designing your site using either Figma or Sketch and converting it to a responsive design, what tool do you use or method to create your responsive designs based of the dimensions in your design for the web?
So Figma's got some really good tools for that kind of built right in, right? So Figma's got auto layout and some of that. I'm not as familiar with Sketch, so I can't really speak to Sketch. I'm a Figma girl, but Figma has already got a lot of tools for responsiveness built right in. And then because I am the Kendo React dev advocate, I'm all in on the Kendo React library. We actually have a Figma kit. So you can view all of our components there and use them in your Figma designs. They work really naturally with all of the Figma tools that are already there. And you can export those using our Unite UX plugin, and that will throw them right into the code. So I'm all in on Figma. I think they've done a really great job. And I think, again, maybe a little bit of bias, but because I'm all in on the Kendo ecosystem, that's my go-to now for handling responsive design and for making designs from scratch, knowing that all integrates perfectly and I don't have to sweat it.
Yeah, our designers use Figma as well, so that's what I'm most used to looking at when I look at designs. Yeah, good. Here's another question from Ash. What type of color should be used so that even the person with color blindness can feel the color? Oh, this is really interesting. Yeah.
So there's a little bit here. The real truth is that depending on the type of color blindness that people have, they're not going to be able to feel the color in quite the same way. You'll lose some of that emotional response, which is why you should never be using color exclusively as a way to communicate information. So color, I think, is a really good thing to think of as like a supporting thing, a supporting tool, something you can use to reinforce and to kind of double down. But if you're communicating something exclusively through color, you are going to lose that section of your audience who is either colorblind or just actually blind, who is visually impaired in other ways, who might be using a screen reader or different assistive technology to access your web or application. So my general rule there is to kind of always think of color as your second hitter, like you should always be communicating in text. You should always be using alt text. You should also be making sure that you're not dependent entirely on things like icons or color to indicate. Like I think font forms are a really good example here. There's a lot of bad patterns you can fall into with forms and form validation, where you can something being wrong is only indicated by like a red ring around, or you get just there's nothing else there. And if you are colorblind or visually impaired, you're going to lose that entirely. But if you back that up with like a check or an X icon or an arrow or a little bit of descriptive text that'll say, actually we need the country code of the phone number, or whatever thing is actually wrong they need to correct. It's better design in general. It's a better user experience. Users don't have to guess what they have to fix. It's more obvious. And B, you will reinforce that for anyone who's not able to see the colors. So there's a ramble of an answer, but hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, that was a really good question. It was very interesting. Okay, so any good newsletter or blog you follow for new UI or UX trends or guidelines and stuff like that?
I'm actually embarrassing to admit, I'm not a big newsletter person. I want to be a newsletter person, and yet I'm also a person who will subscribe to newsletters and then immediately delete them when they start to clutter up my inbox. This is a personal failing that I've learned about myself. So no, unfortunately. That's on me though.
It's all good. I can't say I've read too many of those newsletters that I signed up for.
It's like that, and like podcasts will do the same thing where I'll just like subscribe to a bunch of stuff and they just queue up eternally in my like whatever podcast thing. I'm not going to listen to them. I need to make peace with the fact that I'm not going to read them and I'm not going to listen to them.
Yeah. Okay. Ruby asked, any good Udemy courses? I don't know, like, do you have Udemy course? I'll take it.
I wish I had a Udemy course. Hey, Udemy. No. No, again, like there's a little bit here where these are good and valid questions. And I think I might just be the wrong person, or because I didn't come at this self-taught, this happened to be the thing that I did go to school for. I'm not looking for kind of beginner design courses on Udemy personally. That situation was flipped. I'd self-taught, developer, but I'm just not, I don't have as firm a handle on some of those beginning resources because they weren't things that I used personally. But I know that they're out there. I need to come up with a better resource kit and a better answer to that because I think it's a really good question. But I'm afraid I don't know.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, I think this question I can answer. The link for the meeting recording, yeah, it's going to be, I'm going to do some edit tomorrow, so I'm going to try to get it out before the weekend, and you'll be able to find it on the event page, or you could automatically get an email that says, "Oh, the recording is ready," so you can rush that. So yeah, I know everyone is like asking for it. It's a good thing. Yeah, it's just so much good stuff. All right. Okay, so I think we're at time right now. So just to respect everyone's time, I want to just quickly wrap up. Let me post a little bit of just some closing info in the chat. I'm going to include Kathryn's Twitter as well, since I think it's kind of pretty far up in the chat now. Yeah, thank you for all the questions, everyone. Yeah.
And I'll throw out there, I also host most Monday mornings Eastern time. I stream on the Code It Live channel on Twitch. We have a show called Dev by Design where I talk about a lot of this kind of stuff and bring on design industry guests. So if this was something you were into, you might also enjoy that show. Just throw
awesome.
that out there.
Good to know. Good to know. Yeah, I also included some information on some future events. Our events homepage. You can always check that for the most recent updates and calendar. But that will be it. Kathryn, is there any kind of final remarks or encouragement that you want to leave with our audience before we close?
I think just maybe take the mystery out of design, right? Like it's totally something that you can do. It's a skill that can be learned. If it's something that's important to you or interesting to you, then it's absolutely in reach. It's not something crazy. You don't need to go to art school for it. You can design too. Maybe that was cheesy, but but that would be the takeaway I'd hope people have.